What rain, what wind, what cold, and you must be wondering what I'm doing here? On the banks of the Bosphorus Strait in Turkey? With this cold, all this mess that the weather is causing for us here? But there's no way around it. Winter is just like this here in Turkey, and we're gonna have to tell this story this way. Why am I usually in the rain? Am I in the Bosphorus? Because this is where the city of Constantinople was born, in the year 330, when Constantine decided to move the capital of the empire from Rome to here. But way before that, let's go back in time today, because our story goes more than 600 years before the birth of Jesus. To understand why one day this place was called Byzantium, the origin of that name is a certain Greek named Byzantius Byssus. Now, what's the story of this Byssus? After all, they say he was a Greek who came here to settle, to colonize this place. But there's a story that I like more. Popular imagination created the legend that Byssus was the son of Poseidon, the god of the sea in Greek mythology, and his mother was Ceroessa, the daughter of Zeus, the greatest of all Greek gods. Legend has it that once Byssus went to consult the oracle of Apollo and received a mission. He was supposed to lead his group until they found a place to create a new community, and this chosen place should be opposite to the land of the blind. But what was that anyway? I almost forgot to mention I'm in Europe, and across from here is Asia and the Middle East. And that's where the so-called country of the blind was, which was actually called Calcario. Macedonia, and at that time it belonged to the Persians, who were terrible enemies of the Greeks. When the Persians arrived, they chose to remain on the other side before Byssus came. Now what the Persians never knew, or rather only found out later, is that this side here was better, the land was more fertile, and life here would turn out to be much more productive and happy. What ended up happening was that the people of Byssus, who lived on this side, ended up conquering Chalcedon, and then a city emerged on two continents. How is it after all even today? And that made Byzantium, which was all of this here, turn into a global center of commerce. There were people arriving, ships passing by, and a lot of people deciding to stay here for good. And among all these people who came here, once a very important traveler appeared who had made history over in the lands of Jerusalem, over in Galilee where Jesus lived. Do you know who it is? His name in Aramaic was probably Gaba or Gabai, because that word meant brave, courageous, which is exactly the meaning of the name in Greek. Andreas, now do you know who it is? Because the name that came to us through the Gospels, which were written in Greek, was Andreas, which changed in other languages to Andrew, or even to Andre in Portuguese and Spanish. Because the Apostle Andre arrived through these waters and entered the city, more or less like I'm doing now. According to the Gospel of John, Andre and Simon were Galilean fishermen listening to John the Baptist when something extraordinary happened. And seeing Jesus pass by, John said, "Behold the Lamb of God." And the two disciples heard him say this and followed Jesus. Turning around and seeing that they were following him, he said to them, "What are you looking for?" And they said, "Master, where do you live?" Jesus? He said, "Come and see." It was Andre, the brother of Simon Pedro, one of the two who heard that from João and had followed him. He found his brother Simon first and said to him, "We have found the Messiah." The reality is that we have very little accurate historical information about what happened to each of the apostles. Most of the time, what we know came from oral tradition, which was later written down. But tradition can often be true, but it can also be inaccurate, not revealing exactly what happened, only what tradition has told us. The first Christians taught that each apostle generally founded a major church. If St. Peter founded the Church of Rome, St. Andrew would have founded the church here in Constantinople. The the only source that informs us about Andrew's passage through Byzantium, because at the time it was not called Constantinople. It's a book from the 2nd century, which means it's quite old, from the same century, for example, as the Gospel of John. A book called Acts of Andrew, which tells the whole story of the Apostle Andrew, what it would have been like after the crucifixion of Jesus. It talks about his journey through the Middle East and his coming to Europe. And in this book, the Acts of Andrew, there is a moment when it tells about a brief visit of Andrew the Apostle here in the place that was called Byzantium. I brought the passage here to read to you. Boarding the ship, he sailed to the Hellespont on his way to Byzantium. There was a great storm, Andre prayed, and there was calm. They arrived in Byzantium. It's the only reference here in the manuscript, Andre's passage through Byzantium. Could it be that he didn't stay here for very long? Maybe we don't have information because no one knew exactly what happened. It's hard for us to come to any conclusions when we don't have precise historical information. As I was saying, what we know comes from tradition, and that tradition was built later on. It could be true, of course it could. It makes sense to think so, but we can't be sure. I keep wondering if Andre didn't perform exorcisms, for example, healings, conversions. Did he not found assemblies, really establish a new headquarters for the congregation of Jesus, appoint deacons, priests? There's not a single line about that in the historical manuscripts. If there's no document, we listen to tradition, knowing that tradition isn't always right. And what tradition tells us is that the Apostle Andrew founded the Patriarchate of Byzantium and appointed Eustathius as bishop to take care of the flock. After that, it is said that the Apostle Andrew continued his mission of evangelization all the way to Russia, where he planted another branch of the Orthodox Church. For almost 3 centuries, the Christian church here in Byzantium functioned in the same way as in other places in the Roman Empire, in the catacombs, in caves, many times in secret meetings, in the house of some disciple, always in hiding, because the religion was forbidden. Until suddenly, because of a dream, or at least that's what we were told, that it was because of a dream, everything changed. In a little while, I'll tell you more about this dream. But for now, what we need to be sure of and know in order to understand. The story is that in the year 313, Emperor Constantinos signed the Edict of Milan, allowing religious worship throughout the Roman Empire. At that time, Byzantium was already part of the Roman Empire. After that, Christianity came out of the catacombs and began to gain strength and also power. And what's interesting is that we're telling this story here in the place that was once Byzantium, then became Constantinople, and now is Istanbul. To think that it was exactly in this place that the history of humanity began to change. Because after all, it was at that moment that in a way the world became Christian. Shortly after, Constantinos moved the capital of the empire to Byzantium and changed the city's name to New Rome. But the truth is that this name didn't really catch on. And since Constantinos died shortly after, people only called this city Constantinople, and that's how it was renamed. This here is one of the jewels of Christian architecture from the Byzantine era. This is the church of Irene, or Saint Irene. It was built by order of Emperor Constantinos himself and has a particular feature. It was built on the exact spot where local tradition says that Saint Andreas, the apostle of Jesus and brother of Saint Peter, came to found his church. This is the Byzantine tradition. And after Constantinople was established, we are exactly in the place where one of the first apostles of Jesus came to preach and plant the first cross, in lands far from Jerusalem. Initially made of wood, the Aya was one of the first great churches of Constantinople and even preceded the gigantic Aya. Sophia became a symbol of Christian faith in a city where paganism and Christianity coexisted, to Brazil. When we we look at the Church of St. Irene, well, actually, when we admire this Byzantine work, so interesting, so different from everything we know, we have to think of it as a surviving church. First, there was a revolt in the 6th century, still at a time when there were many Christians in this city, which led Emperor Justinian, who was very Christian, to build a new church. He basically renovated St. Irene, but after that there were earthquakes, many wars, conquests, and more conquests. Everything occurred in Constantinople, which later became Istanbul, and the church is still standing, and what's really interesting is that it was never converted into a mosque. In other words, for some reason the sultans decided to respect St. Irene, they left it here, and notice that it's right next to the Sultan's palace. Not just one, but several lived next door, not in this wonderful place, not in this castle you're seeing. So it's a surviving church that tells us a lot about the history of Christianity. He lived in turbulent and very violent times, was misunderstood, persecuted, betrayed, but his message crossed the centuries and transformed the world. The life of Jesus Christ is a story of courage, love, and faith that still inspires us today. Almost nothing is intact inside the church. Now a museum. The only thing to see is the architecture. Now here in this little corner under this single arch, those who once decided to destroy the Christian memory preserved a small strip of mosaic, a small part where we can see 3 crosses. Everything leads me to believe that these are 3 X-shaped crosses, which is exactly the shape that tradition tells us was the cross of St. Andrew. It is said that after many years of preaching and evangelizing here in Constantinople and in other parts of the world, Andrew the Apostle was sentenced to death in Patras, Greece. The intention of the Roman Empire at the time was to crucify him on a cross like the one Jesus was crucified on. But what tradition tells us is that, so as not to be crucified in the same way as the Master because he did not feel worthy, Andrew asked them to make a cross in the shape of an X for him. Christian tradition states that he was one of the first disciples of Jesus, and that by all indications he was with him until the last moments of his life. He left Jerusalem, fulfilling the mission given by the Master to take his message to other peoples. The church still preserves an atrium illuminated by upper windows, which are a unique feature in the architecture of that time. Up there we can still see a cross of Jesus, not the one of St. Andrew, which was different also in the arch of this part. Here we can see some traces of the church's old decoration that have survived over time. For a long period during the Ottoman Empire, the church was used as a weapons depot, meaning it wasn't turned into a mosque, but it wasn't a church either. It was only in the 19th century that this place became a museum, as we see here, a museum without many pieces, which is currently even under renovation. Can we say this is exactly where the Apostle Andre preached and founded the Eastern Christian Church? We'll never know. Tradition says that when he was taken to the Holy Cross, Andre exclaimed, "Hail, precious cross, sanctified by the body of Christ, let me embrace you." He is said to have hung there for 2 days, preaching to those who gathered around until the moment of his death. From what the Gospels tell us, by following St. Jesus, Andre stopped being just a simple fisherman from Galilee and became, as the Master asked, a fisher of people. He is said to have introduced Jesus to people on the Black Sea shores. I leave here reflecting on the fact that St. Andre's cross was in the shape of an X. Even if it wasn't a historically proven fact, even if it was just a tradition, the idea of the X for us refers to multiplication, and Saint Andre played a very important role in Jesus' miracle of multiplication, when he brings a boy who had 5 loaves and 2 fish, saying to Jesus, "But this is not enough. What are we going to do with so little food?" Jesus and the apostles were in a grassy area like this one, and Jesus told everyone to sit down. And when he started serving, we have an account that that bread and that fish became enough food for more than 5,000 people.